Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Eternal Contenders video. So today I'm finally going to talk about FTP Moment. The deck has been quite popular in the last couple of weeks after Batteries has played the deck for so long and shoved it down everyone's throat basically until they gave it a try and other people like started working on it and stuff. I put it in Contenders because I think the deck is at best a good tier 2 deck. I don't think it's an actual top deck, a tier 1 deck. So I put it in here. And yeah, let me tell you a bit about my story with the deck. I have disliked it for like the longest time, like very early when Battery started like playing the deck and played his, I think, first ETS with it. We played against each other and I had like a brute version of my own on my account, so we talked a bit about it and I gave him some feedback on what I disliked about his list and things I would suggest he try and stuff, but that's been like months ago, I think by now, like after the release of Dusk Road. The deck back then was more of a Curiox deck than a Moment deck. Was not even running Moment in his version at the time, I think, and I'm not sure if I was, because there were like two options to take the deck. But yeah, I didn't really like the deck and the versions that I tried. Like some while ago, Buckwheat has been messing around with the deck a bunch on our team, and yeah, he basically tried like two top-end things, since Curiox kind of, yeah, was just a bit too cute and not powerful enough, given that it's so vulnerable to removal and silence before it ever does more than being a 1-for-1. And yeah, so he has been messing around with Ascendants in the beginning, but they were like only one option, and the other option that he tried was Molot and Nakova. By now, a fair share of people are running Molot and Nakova. Not sure if it's because of Buckwheat or just in general, but anyway, Buckwheat drew my attention to Molot as an option that I didn't really try or consider before, and at the time I didn't really pay much attention to it either because I just didn't like the deck. But recently I thought about if there's like a way to make the deck work in a way that I actually like it, because there were a lot of things that I disliked about the deck and felt like the deck is inherently flawed, being sort of like a controlling mid-range deck that kind of outclasses and outvalues other mid-range decks, while not having enough threat density and pressure against control, and also being too clunky and slow in its early game to reliably beat aggressive decks. And yeah, when I thought about like if there's a way to make me like the deck, one of the things that came to mind was the idea of Molot and Nakova that Buckwheat has been messing with, because I kind of like the card against control if you have enough other strong threats like the deck already does, and then you add like an 8/8 multi-faction Aegis unit on top with flying, the opponent eventually will be out of answers to stop that. Like they will deal with your Titans and Heart of the Vaults and maybe your Moment even, but then if you drop an 8/8 Aegis on top, they often just kind of like, can't really keep up anymore, and you also can't, unlike a lot of other Aegis units, kill Molot and Nakova with relic weapons. And a couple of other changes I implemented ultimately made me arrive at a list that, made the deck seem much more interesting and appealing to me, and I think make the deck better. So let's take a look at the list and I'll talk about the card choices and the cards that I didn't play. Okay, so here's the deck list. So the cards that you usually see that I'm playing as well are 4 Torch, 4 Equivocate, 4 Seek Power, 4 Strategize, 4 Hailstorm, 4 Wisdom of the Elders, probably 4 Sandstorm Titan, 4 Heart of the Vault, and 4 Moment of Creation. And by now most people play some number of Molot and Nakova as their top end. And then there's like all the other choices that people don't have. So first I want to talk about a couple of cards that I considered but didn't end up running. Like for example, the alternative that I had in my initial brews very early in the beginning that I also discussed with batteries was Devoted Theurge over Titan to try and like have the deck have cards that are good against aggro and good against control, because Theurge is pretty nice against control as a 4/4 that gains you 4 health and can gain you incremental health further, and control can also not ignore it in a long game because it keeps growing and growing, so they have to deal with it's a threat that they have to answer, just like Titan. So it's surprisingly solid on its own as a threat and against control, which is important to have that double duty. But in the end, I think Titan is probably just a bit better because it's a bit bigger, so if it survives, it locks up the ground better, and the deck can sometimes struggle a bit with flyers, so having the units that you like the most units possible also deal with flyers in blocking is nice, and now we have 4 Titans and 3 Molot and Nakova to deal with flyers, while Heart and Moment are not capable of doing so. And yeah, the other top-end options in place of Molot and Nakova that you might sometimes see were Curiox, which, like the 6-cost Curiox, the FTP Curiox, which by now basically is completely out of favor. Nobody runs that anymore. The deck tended to run Power Stone at the time to support it, and yeah, the card is just has the problem that it's very bad in grindy games, because those will often be against opponents with a lot of silence and removal, and then just play your Curiox and they kill it, and then it's just a 1-for-1 like a 6-cost Sandstorm Titan. Nothing impressive. And Molot and Nakova at least is like a hard to answer card that has the potential to be a 2-for-1 or even more sometimes with the Spark, which actually happens sometimes. The other thing is Mythic Ascendant. I think Ascendant is pretty bad in this deck. First of all, it's a good Annihilate target. The deck doesn't have a lot of those. Like, sure, there's Titan, but a lot of the time your opponent will have an Annihilate sitting in their hand if they play it, and just be happy to see an Ascendant to get rid of it right away, cheap and efficient. The other thing is Ascendant is just more, like, better at closing out the game against aggro decks that have few good answers to shut down an Ascendant at the top of your curve. You just kind of like slow them down, cripple their board, drop an Ascendant, and then Ascendant takes over. But in like grindy mid-range games, and especially in games against control, an Ascendant is basically just a big Temple Scribe. The opponent will more often than not be holding removal and be prepared for your Ascendants, so you don't really get a lot of power out of it. So it's basically just a bad Heart of the Vault, like a really bad Heart of the Vault. Actually, it's also pretty slow, since it's basically a 7-drop. So once you're already like running something slow, the difference between Ascendant and Molot and Nakova is not very big, except Molot and Nakova takes over way harder and also stabilizes really well as an Aegis flying blocker that completely locks up the board on defense. And yeah, Molot and Nakova is just another card that taxes the things that we already tax, like Slays and Vanquishers and Death Strikes with our Moments and Hearts to eventually overload the opponents. And yeah, the Aegis is really nice, and the Spark actually matters a fair share against various decks sometimes, so I've been quite impressed with the card, and Mystic Ascendant is not something that I can recommend. Okay, then the other thing is, you usually see more than 2 Permafrost. I even started at 4. Most people right now I think run 3. The thing with Permafrost is, while I think the card is really efficient and deals with most threats in the game, I think it's pretty poor in late game decks that don't run actual sweepers. Like if you run Harsh Roll, it's not that big of a deal. You Permafrost something in the early or mid game, it will lie around for a couple turns, and then you're just gonna like sweep the board anyway and sweep the Permafrosted unit away. So whatever ways the opponent has to later break the Permafrost won't matter, because the Permafrosted unit is gone. There are Enforcers and Plates and other ways to return a unit, like Praxis Displacer or Shatter Glass Mage to kill the Permafrost and so on. All won't matter, because yeah, the unit is only temporarily gonna be in play Permafrosted anyway. It basically just shuts down the unit until you sweep the board the next time. But if you basically never really sweep the board, Permafrost becomes a lot worse, because just permafrosting that fatty to have your opponent just get it back, either get a lot of value out of a bounce effect that otherwise would be very marginal, or even get a huge tempo and value swing out of something that gives endurance or silences, is a pretty big blow to a quite controlling deck like this. So I really don't want to rely on Permafrost. Having a few is nice because the card is still extremely cheap and versatile, and there is a fair share of decks where the card is actually great because they have no way of punishing it, but there is still a lot of decks that have 4+ ways to punish it, so I really don't want to rely on it if I have to. That's why I ended up cutting 2 Permafrost for 2 Polymorph. That might seem a bit odd because Polymorph is not the most powerful card or the cheapest either, but I felt like the deck could really use some more answers to the more annoying threats. Polymorph helps you have additional answers for cards like Tavrod, which is important to deal with. Even with Icaria, because that's the other thing that I really dislike about Permafrost. Permafrost is really bad against most control decks because they're usually like unit light decks like Icaria decks. There's there's Fallon Control, where Permafrost is actually great, but it's not like Polymorph is much worse against them either, so because the cost doesn't matter much, and in the end upgrading Permafrost over Polymorph just benefits you in some cases, hurts you in like a few minor other cases, and doesn't matter in a bunch of cases either. So having more ways that your removal, which is already not great against control decks, is at least useful, and that completely blank is nice, but the main reason really is to have more ways to deal with cards like Titan and stuff like that. Yeah, Titan, Tavrod, all that sort of stuff. The kind of cards that you want to reliably shut down, and also against the decks that Permafrost has blowback, like against Praxis you really don't want to be permafrosting a World Bearer Behemoth just for them to Displacer or Shatterglass Mage it, while just polymorphing it, making sure it never gets an attack trigger and doesn't come back to haunt you is great. So yeah, I've been reasonably happy with the 2 Polymorph over the 2 Permafrost, and yeah, I mean the other cards don't need a lot of explanation that everybody is running. Strategize, Wisdom are your bread and butter early and mid game to make sure you find everything you need and have enough resources and power drops to get to the late game and fight your battles. Hailstorm is just arguably the best sweeper in the game because Harshuel is mainly better against like time mid-range decks. Against most other decks that you want to sweep earlier, and Hailstorm sweeps most of what you want to sweep. Like against Argenport, Hailstorm sweeps everything except their 4-drop and Tavrod. So it's pretty good there, and it's good against all the aggressive decks. Basically Justice mid-range and aggro. So the only other deck that you would want to sweeper against is time mid-range, which is not even that popular. So Hailstorm is kind of better positioned than Harshuel for that reason. And yeah, I mean, Moment, Heart, and Titan are the core threats of the deck. I think 2 to 3 Molot and Nakova is the right number. I could see going down to 2, I could not see going up to 4. And I've been fairly happy with 3 at the moment, since you also want enough threat density and top-end punch to win longer games and outlast other control decks and mid-range decks. One other big difference to most lists that you see is I just simply run more power. I don't run any additional power surge because of like Seek. Since Find a Way is just atrociously slow, I don't think you can ever afford to realistically run Find a Way in this deck. Like maybe 1, but that's about it, and the card is so agonizingly slow. Like each of the 2 pieces basically costs 3, and your power base is already slow. And I think the only way you can realistically run especially multiple findaways in a deck, is if the deck runs Harshul, and or if the deck is basically 2-faction and runs a mostly fast and like undepleted power base and just uses Findaway for additional color fixing and or just to make sure you have enough power cards as like card advantage basically. But as fixing in a deck like this, I think the card is horrendous and creates a lot of the slow clunky draws that make this deck just roll over and die. And that's one of the things that I hated. So I tried to build a power base without any additional search that still is providing the requirements the deck needs. And I think I managed that. One thing that I do here, as you can see, is I run 12 crests. A lot of lists I see run like 8 to 10. And crests are really, really powerful. And if you don't run like these shabby findaways or stuff like that, then you actually can afford 12 crests, and they're gonna add a lot more stability to your deck than Findaway will, while being a lot less slow. And yeah, I run 28 power plus 4 Seek, 32 power total, because we have 4 7-drops and 3 8-drops. I think 31 total would just be a bit too greedy. Like if you look, for example, at Galgamation's Feln control deck that he has been doing really well with, and even Tin Man managed to take to rank 1. At times he even had 33, and his deck had slightly less draw, arguably because of Heart of the Vault. But it also only had 3 8-drops and 1 7-drop. This has 3 8-drops and 4 7-drops, and you also have 12 crests, which help you with controlling drawing too much power later, because you can just bottom power that you find on top of your deck with crests and control your draw steps that way and so on. And you also just need enough non-slow power to actually be able to curve out in critical turn spots, so you can just play depleted power on off turns, and say on turn 4 for your Titan you have your ready power and stuff like that. So there's like 7 seeds and 9 sigils, 3 of each, because that's the requirements we have, and then the seeds add a lot of fixing. It's also worth keeping in mind that while Find virtually sort of adds 2 of each color to the deck, it effectively only adds 2 colors when you draw it, because it's effectively not gonna do more than a seed. Sure, you can control which colors you get, but you still only get 2. And if you draw a seed like any duel or crest or whatever, they give you 2 sources too. Sure, it gives you a little less control over what sources, but having a critical amount of cards that provide 2 influence at the same time has been really important for these types of power bases to hit these steep requirements, and seeds also are a lot less slow than Find, so it's really not that much of a downgrade. And the deck has enough spell density to not need Find for that either. Moment is something that you don't play that early anyway a lot of the time, and even if you have to, it's usually against aggro decks where 2 4/4s or 2 5/5s is more than enough to outclass anything the aggro deck usually has as attackers. So, and that you can easily manage, and in other matchups, by the time you play your Moment, it's usually at least 5/5, 6/6, or 7/7, around that range. And yeah, so would definitely recommend not playing additional slow power fetch stuff. I tried 2 secret pages over 2 seeds for a bit, but it just didn't feel right. Like 3 is a lot, it's very clunky, and in the end you often don't ramp that well into your 6-drop anyway, because you're missing an influence still, or you have a depleted source and so on. And pages also doesn't help with the other seeds either, so it's not great there. I contemplated an Eileen's favor or 2, in the end decided against it, because I would basically have to say cut a Seed of Fury and reduce my fire sources, which in turn hurts Heart and Molot. But if you really want to, I could see cutting a Seed of Fury for like an Island's Favor, but I wouldn't want more because Island's Favor is still extremely slow and clunky, but it's neat to have a Face Aegis potentially, I guess. I also considered Cobalt Waystone, but I think you really just can't afford to, since it just makes the power base too slow and clunky. But if you really want to, once again, you could try something like cutting a Primal Sigil and a Seed of Fury for 2 Waystones, or 1 Seed of Fury for a Waystone. This was actually, the third of these was actually a Waystone for a while, but I felt like I want a bit more fire to be more stable, and there's just no need to be greedy with your power base for some incremental gain like a Face Aegis, and then just lose because you get color screwed, or because your power is too slow and you have to take a turn off to fetch a power or play a depleted power, where a ready power would be really critical, and you have this Waystone hand with a bunch of seeds and just slowing it down too much and stuff. So yeah, that's why the power base looks the way it is. And last, the things that might stand out are 1 Swindle and 3 Levitate and 0 Trailblaze. First of all, I think Trailblaze is horribly underpowered and horribly overcosted and not playable in a deck like this that is already so reactive and slow, doesn't have the same catch-up power as Justice controlling decks with Harsh Rule and Play or Vanquish, because our removal is definitely more situational and less effective, so we can't throw all our tempo out the window early. So I really don't like Trailblaze. The card is just so clunky, and I have 12 crests. They already provide me with a nice amount of scout and more scout than the average other list that has to play more ready power to even accommodate their Trailblazes. And the other thing is the deck has a certain softness to Aegis units, so Levitate basically gives you more spell density for Moment, makes your deck smaller due to the cantripping, and happens to provide you with a free way to break Aegis on Sheltering Riders, on Molot and Nakovas, on Icarias, on Throne Wardens, on Crownwatch Paladins, like end of turn, levitating a Crownwatch Paladin just to Hailstorm their 2 guys on the next turn, for example, is great. So yeah, Levitate, great addition to the deck. Buckwheat tried it at some point in our team because he refused to even try Trailblaze because it's just, yeah, so clunky and so weak of a card that it's like not even sound in theory to play the card. And yeah, Levitate seems like a great placeholder, like a great slot for the cantrip thing, while at the same time helping the deck with its Aegis softness. And initially I had 4 Levitate, and then I felt like the deck could use a little bit more staying power, a little bit more punch in terms of grindiness and value, so I cut the Force Levitate and tried adding 1 Swindle, partially because the deck does not have a 5 cost card, so having 1 5 is sort of free in the sense that it just lets you do something like Titan into Swindle sometimes, and just fits in with like other cards nicely. I wouldn't want another 6 or 7 or 8, because we already have a fair share of those, but 5 was like the most expensive I could see going. I considered Staff of Stories, but the deck is just not good enough, I think, at supporting Staff, and Swindle also fits well with Moment of Creation being a spell and all, and the deck is solid at sparking, I would say. And so far the 1 Swindle has played pretty well and pretty nice, and made quite some impact in some games by just putting you far enough ahead by drawing 3. We all know how powerful drawing 3 can be from, say, Channel the Tempest. Like, drawing the 3 cards from a channel often is what puts the game away, and it's no different with Swindle, except we don't get to deal the damage as well, but it's also a lot cheaper. So yeah, this slot is not like an absolute must and 100% right, but it has been playing pretty well and I've been pretty happy with it so far. I couldn't fault anyone for just, I don't know, cutting it and playing the Force Levitate again, for example. And I guess at that point it would be not unreasonable to consider and see if cutting one seat for another non-power card could work out with like 4 Levitates and another expensive card gone, but it's probably still a bit ambitious. Like the deck really wants to hit 8 for the Molots and Nakovas and 7 for Moment, so more likely than not the 28 power plus 4 Seek, even with the cantripping and stuff, are the right number. Between the Scouts and Strategize, the deck is also pretty capable of getting rid of too much power while at the same time making sure you hit your 8 power and also get all your colors. That's the other thing, like if you cut a Seed of Fury, you're reducing the colors from 20-20-19 to 19-19-19, making the deck a bit weaker, and the deck really needs double Primal early, so the 20 Primal are important for the turn 3 Wisdoms and Hailstorms, generally early game, while the 20 Fire are very important for Molot and Nakova and Heart of the Vault, because triple Fire is like the most important triple influence, because if you have triple Time, that only helps your Heart. If you have triple Primal, that only helps your Molot and Nakova. But if you have triple Fire, you're halfway there for both, and then you can usually at least play one of the two. Like if you have triple Fire, you more often than not have either triple Time or triple Primal around turn 6 to turn 8, so you can usually at least play one of the two if you make sure you have triple Fire at least. While if you have triple Time and a Molot in hand and like triple Primal, you can't play anything. The same goes obviously for like having triple Time and triple Primal with a Heart in hand and then not having Fire. So triple Fire is the one you want to set up first, so you can at least play one of the two triple Fire drops, depending on which triple other influence you get first, Time or Primal. So yeah, that explains also the like focus on influence distribution, and yeah, deck has been kind of fun and surprisingly solid. Molot and Nakova plays pretty well in the deck, and the deck actually is now in this version surprisingly good against control. Like I've been winning most of my control games lately, and yeah, having minimum amount of dead cards has been pretty instrumental. Like another thing that I should probably touch on that people might be running that I'm not running is Purify. I think you can only run so many removal spells and so many, especially so many like removal spells that are limited to what they deal with. And we already have 4 Torch and 4 Hailstorm for stuff that deal 3 and only deal with units with 3 health or less. So how many 3 health units you really want to kill? So I don't think adding Purify in the main deck does a whole lot here other than leave you too often with the deal 3 in hand when you have to kill something bigger. So I would not run any additional main deck Purify, since against like small early units, Permafrost is just better. The only card that beats Permafrost is Torch, and we have 4 of those. And Hailstorm is a sweeper, so it doesn't compare, but the next best cheap early removal is Permafrost, not Purify. And we don't even run for Permafrost for the reasons that I mentioned. So before I would even consider Purify, I would run for Permafrost. So there's a very reasonable chance that there would be like 0 Purify even in the 90 and wouldn't even make it into sideboard. And the other card that I see a lot is Caleb's Choice, and I hate that card. I think that card is unplayable in the main deck. I get that some people play it because of like Feln, because they're afraid of Gift and Rain of Frogs, but first of all, the most established version from Galgamation I think doesn't even play Rain of Frogs, and only 1 Gift with no tutors, so that's also not a great reason. Feln is also not that popular, and the deck is not always even that vulnerable to either of those cards. I think you can only run something like that in the board, and even there Unseal would just be better. Caleb's Choice just hits way too few relevant cards. It doesn't hit Daisho, it doesn't hit Rise, it doesn't hit Moment of Creation, it doesn't hit cards like Other Choices, and so on and so forth. There's just so many things that you cannot hit, and hitting like a Runehammer, for example, is not very relevant. The deck has Torches and Hearts and big units and stuff like that, and so like killing an obelisk with the choice is also not very strong, and also there's not a lot of obelisks. So what you're even getting at this point, you get the odd one-off gift sometimes, and yeah, like countering something like Harsh Roll is not even that good most of the time in a deck like this either. So you get a couple of like low impact situational things. Like sometimes you get lucky and get like a Rain of Rocks that your opponent probably shouldn't have in his deck in the first place in the main deck on ladder. Or you hit like a Wisdom, which is nice but not game breaking either. And then there's all the other times where you're facing aggressive mid-range and aggro decks and you have this crappy Caleb's Choice in your hand and you just die and wish it was anything that did something, like a cheap card draw spell or cheap removal, basically. So yeah, I think if you want to deal with cards like Rain of Frogs and Gift and stuff like that, just play Unsealed in your board and stay away from Caleb's Choice. The card is just too narrow, like even as a sideboard card. I think it's a bad main deck card and it's a bad sideboard card, because in sideboard you can have better, more dedicated cards, and in the main deck these types, like counter effects, are just too narrow most of the time in this game to run main deck, especially in a reactive deck that needs to draw enough answers and enough of the right answers against what the opponent's presenting already, and that's a lot of pressure on each card in your deck to be as flexible and helpful as possible, and Caleb's Choice just doesn't do that. So yeah, I think by now I have touched on all the possible cards that people are playing and that I don't like or hate and would not recommend playing. Alright, that's it for the deck list. This was a surprisingly long deck tech. Again, been a while that they got this long. But yeah, I've felt like there's a lot to discuss and explain here, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And yeah, it hopefully was very informative and educational for you guys, and helps you better with building your own moment of creation and decks in general, and understand decks and deck building better. And enough talk for now. Time to hop into some games, so see you in a moment for game 1 in Ranked.